I sat down with Emily Evans Eerdmans, who's a design historian, author, and designer. You may know her from the legendary Sotheby's sale bidding farewell to mentor Mario Buatta, as well as the author of multiple books on his legacy and design work. Not only did we talk about and uncover the stories and inspirations behind her work, her journey, her books, but she was so kind to vulnerably, authentically, genuinely share anecdotes and perceptions and perspectives from her relationship, her very personal working relationship and friendship with Mario Buatta. And I thank her for that. I think that you will glean a lot from this conversation. You will get to know Mario Buatta and Emily on a deeper level. And I hope it also inspires you to look into history a little bit more. The transformative power of art and history in our lives is not lost on me in this conversation, and I just hope that you enjoy it. Welcome to Grandma's Silver, where tradition meets today. I'm Allie, your host and the founder of the Grand Millennial Lifestyle. Here, we blend aesthetics with nostalgia, engaging in conversations with lifestyle brands, designers, and more to rediscover the timeless charm of the past. Join me as we journey from home to heart, illuminating the past and polishing the present with the gleam of Grandma's Silver. Well, hello, Emily. Thank you for being here. I'm so excited to chat with you. And I figure I'll pass the mic, so to speak, over to you so that you can go ahead and fill everybody in on who you are, your background, and what you do today.
Allie, I am so happy to be here with you. So this is a question I hate because when someone's like, well, what do you do? Like in an elevator or at a cocktail party, I never know how to answer the question. I often say I'm a design historian and I use books, little shows at my gallery, and other ways to kind of tell the stories that I want to tell and to research the subjects that fascinate me.
I love that. And my background, we won't talk very long about this, but my background is anthropology and archaeology. I then went into event planning. And so I have a very similar response when people are like, what do you do? Because it's a loaded question because
It
you
really
find
is.
ways to blend your passions together professionally. So I get it. Let's start with some of your design background and that journey.
Absolutely. So I grew up an introvert and love to spend time by myself and read. I was always reading till 3 a.m. In the dark when I was little. And I really love to learn. I didn't necessarily love school, but I love to learn and pour myself into things. And so when I went to college, I ended up majoring in Latin, which I knew I was never going to use. So my mother's a potter. I've come from a creative family. It was never instilled in me that I needed to focus myself in a practical way, if that makes sense.
It does. I had a very
Uh,
similar, yeah.
and I know and now I see that there are pros and cons to that. But I now see it as such a gift that I was allowed to let my inner radar speak, and be able to hear it because not everybody gets that. One might take that for granted. And ultimately, I ended up studying Latin because I wanted to go to Rome for a semester in college. And I had a fabulous Latin teacher in high school. But when I came to graduate, I knew I don't want to be I didn't want to be a Latin teacher. I didn't want to be a teacher at all, really. And so I had my senior year of college, my gut was telling me I needed to get to Paris. I just had to be there. So started taking French. I had taken it in high school as well. My I interviewed for all sorts of positions that I didn't get, but then through a family friend, I became an au pair in Paris after graduation, and I moved to Paris for 2 years. And that changed my life. The whole French approach to everything should be excellent in your life. Everything should bring you as much pleasure or be as considered Curated is such an overused term, but I would say the French really do highly curate their life. And it's better, even though I'm a maximalist, for them, it's better to have a little bit of the best than lots of mediocre. So that really, and as an au pair, for the second year, I worked for a family where the mother was an architect and worked from home, and I needed to be out on the streets with the little girl. Like we were not really encouraged to be there. So we went to like every single there are so many obscure museums in Paris, and we went to all of them. And it was experiencing house museums. Of course, we have them in the States, but they generally will go back to, you know, I grew up in Ohio, so we had one in our little town, and it was circa like 1820.
Mm-hmm.
But house museums that can go back even more hundreds of years, and just being surrounded by everything that's so old. And for me, I understood how environments or interiors really spoke to me. And my love of art history wasn't just sort of an isolated painting on a wall, but it was sort of going into a room where everything was a universe and it all spoke to each other. Astor, the little girl, was at ballet one day, and I would always go and get a cafe creme and read the Tribune, International Herald Tribune, which I don't even think is in print anymore. There was an advertisement for Sotheby's Institute of Art in London. And the whole approach was you're learning about furniture and silver and ceramics and old masters and modern master and paintings. And so I feel so lucky that it was like, again, one of those moments where you're like, click, like, yes. And so I got myself over to London for an interview, and I started the next September, the grad school. And so that's learning. I think in the United States, we don't really think about the decorative arts so much, or studying furniture, ceramics as such a high level as
Mm-hmm.
paintings or 2D art or however you want to describe it. So that spending time in Europe really created that awareness that that was a path I could go down. And while I was studying at Sotheby's, I developed a love for 18th century English furniture. Partially, I think, because it was male dominated, and I sort of was like, well, I'm gonna get in
Put me
there.
in, coach.
Yeah, yeah. Like I think, and so eventually when that program was over, it was time for me to like start working, not be a student anymore or like a poor babysitter. And New York was only the place to go if I wanted to work for a high-end antiques gallery like that. And so I did. I worked for 10 years for one. And then I realized, oh, there's more than 18th century English furniture in the world. It's my interest was over that time was piqued by other things, and I wanted to explore other things. And while I worked for that gallery, I had was so lucky to get the opportunity to write my first book with Rizzoli, which was on that gallery's collection and 18th century furniture in general. And then I started teaching part-time at FIT, in the interior design program. It's interesting how, for me, it was always so clear what I needed to do. But then as you get older and you go more into your niche, you're the options start to fall away a little bit. And then I did have times of kind of feeling stuck, and like, what do I do? And like, oh, it was always so obvious to me and now it isn't. So those were interesting to navigate. I'm definitely on the other side of that, and just feeling so alive with everything that I'm doing. But I think everybody goes through those moments, and it's interesting, where in your career do you go through those moments of plateauing or just like, now what?
Yeah.
I'm sure you've had that.
Oh, I have. I'm no longer an event planner, we'll say that. Yeah, I started, it's, very similarly, I was really interested in anthropology and archaeology, but I knew I was never going to be digging.
Yeah.
I knew I was never going to be excavating, and on these archaeological digs for a living, shovel bumming, as they call it. So
Oh,
I just, and I knew I didn't want to go into education, but I wanted to piece it together. I really appreciated tradition and ceremony and the
yeah,
study of people, but through their lifestyles. So not quite sociology, but material culture and more
right.
historical archaeology, which is more, the America. Living in Philadelphia, that probably largely contributed to my appreciation of all of that. So
Yeah.
it is fascinating. And then the tradition, and I started to weave. I've always been like, I always laugh that I'm kind of like an 80-year-old Southern woman from the time I was a kid. I've always loved hosting and entertaining. And so I just was trying to blend the love of culture and tradition and ceremony into a wedding planning company, which was wonderful for so many reasons, but I sort of hit that plateau of I don't feel as fulfilled as I could be. And
Yeah.
so,
Is that all there
yeah,
is? Like Peggy
right.
Lee was saying.
Right.
Yeah.
And I
Mm,
had, the sort of luxury and of that it was my company. And so I was able to choose the direction I went next. And that has led me to a couple of different things, but this is one of them, blending it all together. And so, actually you're talking about the decorative arts I've always loved. I don't live terribly far from Windsor. Um,
right.
and
Yeah.
so, there's a lot going on there, and Delaware has a great program. And so
Yeah.
I've been surrounded by a lot of that. So this is a wonderful conversation for me as well to be able to talk to you because it is just aligned interests, I think. You mentioned your book, your first book. You've authored many, which is an incredible feat. Congratulations, because that is rough. That is hard to do. I think people don't give people enough credit who are incorporating books into their work.
I find writing excruciating. I do not find it easy at all, but they've been what I've, it's, to me, it's been what I've created that's the most important, that I'm the most proud of, is that there's these books, and most of them are kind of style biographies of figures that would otherwise be forgotten. And so I'm sure there will be a reassessment of Madeline Castang and there will be new information. But th that of all the things, I mean, everything is so ephemeral, especially interiors and experiences and moments and tablescapes, but a book doesn't go anywhere, and it sort of captures them in time. So it's, for me, it's been very meaningful to be able to do those.
You mentioned that you consider yourself a bit of a design historian. So understanding that, what influence has that played into the inspiration of some of your books?
Well, it's all about a context. Everything occurs in relation to things that went before and that are going on. And so, for example, with Madeleine Castang, who was a French antiques dealer and also did interior design and developed a vocabulary of fabrics and carpets and colors, that when you see a room that she's done, you instantly know that it was by her, which is, I think, a really strong accomplishment. To understand that when she was coming of age, what she was influenced by, which was very appropriate for your podcast, a nostalgia for basically her grandmother, for there's capturing the past, romanticizing what, not your mother's generation, but the generation before. And I think it's, not all of us, but so many of us have incredibly fond memories of going to our grandmother's house and spending time there. And it's magical. And a lot of when Madeline Castang was going into design, and her story also, I've always been interested in biographies and learning from, well, what decisions, what challenges do they have, and how do they solve them, and what can I take from that? And so Madeline Castang, grew up wealthy, was only meant to marry and be a housewife, basically, and married this wealthy man from this land owning family from the South. And they lost it all when when the Germans seized everything during the occupation of Paris during the Second World War. And she had this house that she loved in the country, Lev, and the Nazis took it. After the war, she had to buy it back. It wasn't just given back to her, it was no longer hers. And her husband said, if you want it, you've got to find a way. Like, it's not going to be given to you. And that's when she actually started at flea markets, and then took gradually, she had a little stall in the flea market, the Poos, and then got a little space and then grew over time. She was, I think, in her 40s when she started. And to me, when I turned 40, I officially decided, okay, there's nothing wrong with having a business and wanting to make money, which is something that I also was taught. Like, you should just do it for the pleasure, for like to create something wonderful, not necessarily for monetary remuneration. But there's nothing wrong. I mean, like, you need to be able to fund things, you
Right.
need to make that happen. So for Madeline Castang, it was sort of understanding how, when she was going back to this kind of 19th century style, because she was born in the 1880s, so this is very much like her grandmother's style, and she found a lot of inspiration in novels like Emile Zola's Nana. She would recreate rooms that were described in these books that were written in the 19th century. So it was this very literary, dreamy style. But then if you think about what's going on in Paris in the 30s, it's Art Deco. It's like, it's sleek, it's hard, it's sexy, it's streamlined. Or there's Eileen Gray, actually, the modernist furniture designer at one point is her next door neighbor, and their building. And they're like such different styles. And so to think, you have to have the context of, she's not just doing this grandma style, she's doing it at a time when no one else is doing it.
Mhm.
It's not like she's rear guard. She's actually avant-garde in how she's being embracing all this stuff that nobody else is really doing. And that was something like with Mario Buatta, when I worked on the second book and I had access to all his archives, and he clipped every single article about him. So reading the ones from the 1960s when he was first starting out, and really seeing how nobody else was doing that, and reading, like, he talked about how people made fun of him for doing his bows and ruffles and dogs. So in the 1960s, like, that wasn't like what a young person in design would be doing. And so there was that, it took courage or a confidence in one's eye. So I think as a design historian, it's, you have to see the full, like, or try to, because everything is always seen through the lens of your own time and through the lens of like who I am and what I see and find interesting. But I think it tells more of the full story, and to place a person and the moment in time. And then also, how have they affected them today, and to see like the strands of their influence is also really fun and fascinating. I mean, that's what you're doing here, I think, is, I mean, you're a design historian, or
In
documenting
some ways,
today.
yes, yes. Firstly, I did not know about, I need to go read that book because that is inspiring to hear, especially in her time,
Yeah, exactly.
a woman doing what she's doing. But then also, if we're talking about Mario Buatta and kind of his initial criticisms, so to speak, you are looking at trailblazers who are not setting out to trailblaze, but who are just sort of following their authenticity and trying to live their
That's right.
lives. And so, yeah, I think it's really special that you're documenting that and capturing it so well. And so, if we were to talk more about Mario Buatta, because I know much of my audience is aware of him and is
Yay.
loves his work, myself included. You have two books on him, books on him?
Two, yes. The
Two.
first one we
Okay.
did together, and then, which was how he wanted to tell the story, and then the second one, that was just me. Yeah.
Okay. So tell me a little bit more about each of those. And of course, the experiences looked very different. So how did even maybe your experience working with him in the first book influence the direction you went with the second book?
So I had never helped anyone do their book before. And the reason I was really interested when Rizzoli approached me as, meeting with Mario to see if we were a good match was because I loved everything that Mario loved. That, his whole design inspiration is Colfax and Fowler, English country house, and having studied in England, London, like that's what I love too. I think we all have those books of when we want to solve a design problem, like what do we go to? And I always go to the Chester Jones, Colfax and Fowler book. So, and then also the fact that Mario, like, hadn't ever written a book, and he was somebody who had, it was the subtitles 50 years of interior decoration, and it ended up being more by the time he died. But it was like he deserved a book. So many, I think now even if you have only been in business for a minute, you have to do a book. It's just the rite of passage to be taken seriously, to go to another level. But that wasn't the case, when Mario was for most of Mario's career. But by the time that he did do it, it was like, oh my God, it's like, it's time. So to be part of that felt like such an honor and a privilege, that it was a book that really needed to exist. The process was really difficult. It was, I mean, again, I like to be alone. I love to do the research and dive deep. And what I didn't anticipate, but should have, I was naive, is that this was going to be not an as told to, but it was how he saw things. And so
Mm-hmm.
I was allowed to talk to certain people. There were things he didn't want in there that I thought should be in there. When he gave a lecture, and I just did an event with Pat Altschul in Charleston, and she brought this up. He would give this lecture as a stand-up comedian act, and people would come and they would want to learn more about his style and like get tips. But instead, you would get him with a fake Italian accent and a toupee and just giving this hilarious version of his life, but it wouldn't really go deep. And he didn't really want to share. It's sort of like
Yeah.
he had to figure out on his own. So you all need to figure it out on your own. So that's what this book was, kind of, and which I found like somebody going to his lectures frustrating because I wanted more. The amazing thing about that book is it's over 400 pages. He was heavily published by Architectural Digest, which was the premier, shelter magazine for so long. They graciously gave him permission to reproduce like anything he wanted to. So the book is so comprehensive in a way visually, which was a problem for the second book because it's like, well, what else is there for the second book? Now in retrospect, like when I now looking back at his book, which the first book, I see it's like you get to be with him. It's actually a really he had already designed the cover before the first meeting with Rizzoli. Everything was picked by him. Even the book designer, Richard Pendicio, who's a genius, got out of Mario's way because Mario was like, this is what I want. I want it like that. And Richard was like, okay. Whereas Richard designed the second book, and I was like, I had almost no input. I was like, just do whatever you want to do, go crazy. Yeah, so it's sort of like it's almost a very intimate experience because if you read that book, it's like you're with him, you're sitting with him. So that's very special that it's just like dripping with his personality and his style. But then the second book, as the historian, I wanted to know, how did this kid who only had a few semesters of college, grew up with the Sicilian immigrant family in Staten Island, where his brother died in the house they grew up in, how did he become like the most famous decorator in America for a moment? In like late 80s, 90s. And how did he become the person that all these billionaires would go to create like old money pedigree style?
Mm-hmm.
Like how did that happen?
Exactly.
So those were some of the, some of the questions I wanted to answer in this book. And also, how did he do it? And he was the kind of person that worked, and this is what I really appreciated working with him on the book. He was meticulous. Like he would not give up on any detail. And he wasn't lazy. So he gave the appearance of, he went to every single party there was, always on the phone, always out socializing. So when did he do all this work? And which was so much work, like because of just one sofa is a bajillion details. Um, and it was like and he didn't really have assistants. They wouldn't last very long. And he didn't want them to steal clients or steal resources from him. So he didn't let them do that much if they did work for him. He just sort of made them cry and sort fabric back into the fabric library. So that to me, that was fascinating to me, and that's what I wanted this book to be like. It was more the how-tos, like what he wouldn't want you to know, but
Mm-hmm.
that was equally as part of who he was and his genius as the first book.
It's interesting because as you're talking, I was so unaware even of just how, in a fairly multifaceted way, he kept people maybe at a bit of an arm's length, whether it was
Mhm.
the public, people working with him, maybe even you when he was working on the book. So that's really interesting, because there is so much personality to his art.
Yeah.
It's interesting that in some ways he was a bit reserved, perhaps, or private is probably the better way to word that. But yeah.
Exactly. And you wouldn't think he was because he was so jolly and laughing and like in constant contact. But there was a deep reserve of privacy within
Mhm.
him. And, like, for example, he would spend every Thanksgiving with these clients who had a big family Thanksgiving. And then Joan Rivers always had like a Thanksgiving lunch or something, and he would go to that. But Christmas, he would spend by himself because he thought that was too much to spend with somebody, to like intrude on somebody else's holiday like that.
Wow.
And he loved Christmas. When we were cleaning out his apartment, he had a Christmas tree in his living room that I think it had been there for like 5 years, but like so many Christmas ornaments. And just to see that he had this love for this holiday that he never really celebrated. There's a little heartbreak to his
Yeah.
story.
That leads me, I mean, you sort of just addressed one of my next questions for you, which I had before we even started talking, understanding you had multiple books on his work and his life, really. But it almost bears different meaning now to ask that as you were working on the second book, were there things that you were uncovering, not even necessarily about his personal life, but even about his work or life, not on, not super in a deep way that would be uncomfortable to talk about, but things that you were discovering that surprised you, even though you had already had this working relationship with him?
I think to see, I mean, he didn't throw anything away. And to see the level of like, for example, every single thing he purchased that he owned, he had an index card for. And often it would say like where he bought it. And he had a collection of auction catalogs that I could tell, like if he circled it really big, that meant he bought it. But he followed different collecting categories of things that he liked that to see how they were doing as the market was evolving. And it was kind of, again, he had such a big personality and seemingly all over the place, but just the level of detail that he was interested in, that to me was really, it became more apparent, like going through his things and seeing how studied or how studious he was. And it's sort of all these little details that he has to put together to make a room what he made it. It wasn't an accident, like he wasn't guessing. It was what he was looking at. Yeah, I guess it just gave me a whole new appreciation for how painstaking he was, because again, that would be the opposite impression he'd want you to have of him. He wants it to be easy and fun and pretty, but
Mhm.
behind all that, and so I could, peeling back the layers of his apartment and seeing all of this was fascinating. And I also came to understand, he was really ahead of his time for kind of creating a personal brand before we ever even talk about like be a personal brand. And Sister Parrish, she often, she would talk about why is he going to all these different parties for fabrics and, for these industry parties? Like, doesn't, like she just wanted to be with her family and and her friends. And when work was over, she had a full personal life. And Mario's personal life was completely blended with his work life, which I think a lot of us can actually relate to. But she represents a generation, like a previous generation, where that was sort of, she found that odd, like she didn't get it. Whereas Mario saw, like licensing, like getting his name on things, which she thought she kind of sniffed at. I think she thought it was maybe tacky or something. But now it's sort of like, who can we collaborate with? How can we, we're all looking for those opportunities. So he was really a visionary. But what was sort of a poignant discovery is that part of his seeing his name in print and why he preserved every article and like put it in these scrapbooks that his name was in was, I think, to show his father. Part of it was to show his father, like, look at what I've achieved, because I don't think his father really understood what a decorator was. Um, Mario, of course, was gay, which I don't think was. I think, cousins have said that they knew about it, but it wasn't ever really discussed. Mario never had a partner, and they grew up Italian Catholic, even though Mario was not religious as an adult at all. So part of it was it was proof that he had made it, proof that he was not going to necessarily get out of the mouths of his father. And his mother had died when he was, in his early 20s or like around 20. So I think that was a huge loss for him. So that was an interesting angle. And then I think I also began to appreciate, especially going through those scrapbooks, understanding how the AIDS crisis really marked him. And again, this is part of like the design history, like what else is going on in the world. And a friend who worked in the design and decoration building in the 90s, so not in the 80s, but still there were a lot of people were dying at that time, said you would go into work and you would see, you'd see people not coming back. You'd see people with the marks on their body, like giveaway. I mean, I don't think we can even fathom what that was like. And I've told the story a few times. When he turned 50 in 1985, he took diet pills to lose weight. And he did. And people assumed that maybe he had AIDS or HIV. And he actually had a client of his, Taki Theodorakopoulos, who had like a society column, write in his column about how straight his decorator was and how he actually just got really fit and like doesn't have the C and like all. And it's like, to ask a client to put, like, so Mario never told me about that article. I just came across it in the scrapbooks. It was like, wow, wow. And for people to think that you had it was poison, like that could have ruined his career. Like, it was sort of like beginning stages of COVID. You just didn't know how you got it. And, everybody was terrified. So there were all these things that he would never have talked to me about, but it sort of explained to me how, and I don't mean to get so heavy duty. I know sometimes I talk about this because to me, it's a very big part of his story, and I didn't really know how to write about it in the book. And I don't think I did because it didn't really make sense, but you know, sex was death in a way. And so, he, I think, sublimated that into collecting and shopping and never, he had dalliances, but never had a partner,
It's so interesting as you're talking. I mean, yeah, it is heavy, but it also humanizes, which in some ways it sounds like is what he was almost trying to get away from. there are even in like modern, if we're talking about today, I won't throw names out there, but I think there are absolutely personalities who just want to be seen as personalities and not seen as people.
Yeah.
And
Ooh.
or their talent, or I think when it comes to looking inward, or I mean, you're describing someone who essentially had to give himself in many ways the pat on the back he wasn't getting from home.
Yeah.
Or not overcompensating because but if his dad wasn't comfortable with his sexuality in ways, like trying to like overcompensate the disappointment that he felt was being received, and saying like, no, look, I'm successful. So it is heavy, but I think how many of us can relate to those different, I mean, that's relatable. Like we've all had, like we all want parents who are proud of us. We all want someone to see us
Yeah.
and say, you're doing a great job. I'm so proud of you. So
Yeah.
I think that, yeah, to hear, that he's collecting his own work. It's not like a parent is sending it to him like, oh my gosh, like, he's collecting his own work and he had his own scrapbooks because he didn't have a parent who was doing it for him. So it's interesting. I mean, I think we should be proud of ourselves too. I think if I was an Architectural Digest, there would absolutely be a frame behind me on the wall. But it's just that sort of humanization that
And I
is.
think it's so easy to look at the kind of rooms that he created and dismiss it as being fluffy or, like there's just too much stuff, or it's pretty, like, oh, it's just
Mhm.
pretty. But there was a lot of depth behind it, that he wasn't, and he was a joker. And if you met him, he probably would have a toupee or fake teeth or a dollar on a string. But he had a lot of depth to him, So I think, I guess why I bring up some of these things, I do it to show, to convey that there was so much there. And I think to relate it to now, I was having dinner with my friend Tug Rice, and he was talking about how post-COVID, he thinks we're all kind of in a funk right now. And I was like, really? Because I'm feeling great. But I've talked about it to other people. They're like, yeah, I think we are in a funk right now. And we just went through a lot. I mean, we went kind of through a war with COVID.
Yeah.
And it was so disruptive, really scary for a period of time. There's going to be, and then of course all the kids who are their last year of high school or in college, like were so brutally affected. I mean, I think we're going to see the aftermath for quite a while. We're turning towards pretty. Like we want to self-soothe, we want nostalgia, we want, minimalist rooms that just have a few incredible sculptural pieces in it are great to look at, but to live in, they're not so cozy or comfortable. And I think perhaps that's why Mario's rooms have some resonance right now, because we're looking for that and there's a place for that. Um and there's meaning to that kind of experience of a room.
I think too, it's interesting. You touched on the pandemic, which, like you mentioned, it was unifying in certain ways because we were all stuck in it together.
Yeah, that
But it
was
was
why.
also traumatic. It was also co-occurrent with a lot of political things that were polarizing. It was, I mean,
Yeah.
there was so much going on. And
Hmm.
I think a lot of people too, lives changed. And then when things started to quote unquote lift, depending on where you lived and your school of thought, that looked different because it
Yeah.
wasn't necessarily like we went back to 2019. It was like we were living in, still sort of, we're out of it, but we're living in like a new normal is what, like,
Yeah.
right, that's what they were saying all the time. And that still hasn't really, like, our new normal is emphasis on the new. Like my life looks completely different than it did in 2019, in some ways for
Yeah.
the better, in some ways it's just what it looks like now. And I think part of, I started the podcast is fairly new, but the Instagram and the brand of Grand Millennial Lifestyle really started for me because I needed to self-soothe, and I was in a space where I was miserable with my event planning career and I was stuck in my house. And so it was like, let me surround myself with at least this virtual reality that I would love to be living, but that I'm not currently. And there's, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, like grandmillennial kind of gained momentum during the pandemic because, and I think you hit the nail on the head that we're all looking for kind of grandma's house. we needed
Yeah.
we needed that hug, and I think we needed that
Yeah.
comfort. It's layers. And it's funny because I've talked to plenty of designers. We know we're not reinventing the wheel here. That's the point. Grand Millennial is a
Yeah.
resurgence of appreciation for all of
Yeah.
these very classic traditional interiors, and many people are modernizing it and doing their own thing with it. But it's it really is just like latching onto simplicity. Some of it is simpler living because I think the pandemic made that shift. In that we
Yeah.
were running, 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 and it felt kind of good to slow down. Um,
Yeah,
I
that's
think
true.
the design, just surrounding ourselves with brighter, happier, layered, cozier. So I think you're hitting the nail on the head in that regard, in that a lot of this kind of happened at the same time when I started to research more of all of this and I got really into interior design again and those sorts of things. I kind of rediscovered Mario and
Mm.
his work and resonated with it very strongly. I think much of my audience has done the same. And it's like you said, it's a lot of course it's beautiful, but there's it's layered. It's a layered,
Yeah, and
yeah.
layers feel really good. More layers feel better to some people than maybe fewer layers feel better to others. But yeah, it's like it's that hug. I'm also going to say that I think as a classicist, there's something about, in talking about classicism versus modernism. So classical has the ornament, the embellishment, the layers versus like stripped down modernism. Like if that's how I'm defining the two, that classical design, which Mario would totally be in that camp, it's timeless. When I look at a photo of a Mario room, I don't necessarily know when it was done, if it was the
Mm-hmm.
60s or 2010, whereas it just looks like a room I can imagine being in, whereas modern rooms often do feel more of a time or dated. I wrote this, my second book was Regency Redux. And what I wrote it out of discovering when I was teaching in design schools that when you get to the 20th century, they just talk about modernism and they don't talk about the continuation of classicism. And if you go back, like one of the most fun things to do is to curl up with like 100 years of Vogue magazines. And so doing research, and I'm looking through all these 1920s and 30s and 40s Vogue magazines, how the people they're featuring when they're showing their backdrops, you do get very modern, but then you also see classical. You have David Adler, the architect, you've got Elsie DeWolf, Dorothy Draper. You have all of these great designers, Billy Baldwin, who are working in the classical idiom, but they're not being taught in design schools. And I think they're both important. It's important to see that classicism is a vocabulary that can be updated and modified to reflect the current day. And one of the things that people don't understand about Mario and Madeline Castang, who also had no schooling, is when they first approach a room, they would look at the architecture and how do you, and Henri Samuel would always say that, do you need to raise the door height? Is the crown molding too skimpy? Or how does the structure of the room need to be amended before you even choose colors and patterns? And all of the best designers know that that's where you start, is with the architecture. And like, do you need to put in a fireplace, or do you, etc. So I think that's also part of this style. It's traditional, but it's classical, and it's continuing the thread, all the way back. I mean, through the 18th century to the Renaissance,
Yeah.
to Palladian houses and the Vicenza region of Italy. So that's also just in terms of somebody, again, looking at design history, that it's important to see that it's like you said, it isn't, we're not reinventing anything, but there's new spins on it that are appropriate for today. I remember Charlotte Moss told me how this, like, somebody who worked in maybe a furniture showroom was like, oh my God, look at this super cool chair. Isn't it amazing? And it was a version of the Clismos chairs, which they had never seen before. But as hopefully people listening know, was something that was in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. This form with these like exaggerated saber legs, and so it's actually something that's been around for thousands and thousands of years and not something new. So history can really, knowing your history, and your design history and studying things from the past can make your work so much more layered and sophisticated. And it's good to know if something is actually not new. It's good to know that. It's good to know that it's yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Now you hit on something because, of course, your background, you have a long history with antiques and also this understanding of design. So, grand millennial, nostalgia, tradition, but also that interplay of modernism.
Mm.
What do you, understanding most of us cannot have homes that are, as much as I would as much as I would love to have a house that is just entirely antique furniture and like a showroom of sorts, a museum, beautiful. What do you think are some ways to kind of blend a love or appreciation of either, even if they're not necessarily antiques and are more vintage, because there is a
Mhm.
difference there, but things that have been passed down that maybe our grandparents gave to us from great grandparents even, or that might not have value in the traditional sense, but that you want to have in your home. And how do you blend those nicely with a more modern, quote unquote, aesthetic?
Well, I would say in particular, I'm thinking of brown wood,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't love brown wood. I like a little bit of mahogany. So I would say if you've inherited like maybe Baker reproduction, which is good quality, from like the 50s or something, paint it. Like that's what I would say. It's a trick that a lot of people, Dorothy Draper did all the time. Miles Red does all the time, buy something at auction or a thrift shop that has kind of Chippendale lines, but then lacquer it in like emerald green or, a historic blue color or something like that. I would say that that's one way to do it. I think if you have a group of things that you've inherited, Mario would always say this, it looks better to have a big group of something than like one little piece here and one little piece there. So let's say you've inherited a collection of Hummel figurines that you just, for some reason, you cannot part with. Put them all together in one place. Or if, blue and white vases, like amass them and then it like makes kind of a statement. Or, brackets, like Mario loved using wall brackets. Like that's also an interesting way to elevate like a knickknack or something that you've inherited, but if you put it on a bracket on the wall, you're making it like sculpture in a way. Though those are a few ways that I think you could kind of mingle it in with your more modern style or update it to fit.
I no, I appreciate that. And it's funny because for years I'd received when we first purchased our home, it was our first home. I didn't really have money, as it is. You don't have a whole lot, you take what you can get. And we'd been given this old dining room table from my husband's great grandmother. And of course, being nostalgic, sentimental, loving vintage pieces, I was initially so honored to have it. But then I realized it didn't work.
Yeah,
It just didn't, it wasn't the
yeah,
right fit. It was too big. I mean, spatially it
yeah.
didn't quite work, but we kept it there for many years because my husband didn't even feel, I felt like oh, it's this thing we need to have. I ended up going to, because I love to thrift and go, I went to my Habitat Restore.
Oh,
I
great.
found this beautiful, we have a lot of gorgeous estate sales around us, and
Oh, yeah.
many people don't know a lot of the Habitat Restores get the what doesn't sell at the estate sale, they'll get dropped off right at the restore, donated. And so I ended up there one day and I got this beautiful like Chippendale dining set for maybe $150. I don't think I paid that much, and it needed work. I did paint it emerald green, but
Oh,
it's just,
cool.
it works so much better in the space. But again, one of those things, it didn't come gorgeous. You have to kind of like look at things with a critical lens. I think people are hard on brown furniture, but brown furniture doesn't have to stay brown, like you just mentioned. So
Yeah,
it has good bones. It can have good bones.
and I love your point how when you have something that you're like, oh, I have to have that, or you inherited it, but it's just not right in the space. It's sort of like in a garden. If you plant something and then you see you're like you actually don't love it, it's like life is too short. Just like
Yeah.
pull out that plant and get something new. To, like give the table to your sister or like store it in your basement for maybe when you move it will work. But I just think that is something I see like when you go visit your friends and you're like, I want to rearrange all their furniture, but you see that something just isn't right. And but most people are like, oh, they just stop looking, stop seeing it, but I think address it, I think
Mhm.
don't live with it, store it if you can, or give it away or loan it. And then like you said, the like we have Housing Works in New York that gets like incredible things from estates. So you don't have to pay a fortune for something.
No.
Yeah. And you can
Yeah,
give it an update.
exactly. And it makes you, it almost is funny as I was saying it, I was thinking about when you were talking about when you were in France, and that
Mm.
concept of just surround yourself with things that you love. And then I didn't mention this because you were talking and you were saying so many wonderful things. I didn't want to interrupt, but you mentioned that Mario had sort of a similar-ish approach in that he had this intentionality that looked very casual.
Mm.
And I think I thought of the French when you were saying that, because it is this attention to detail and this refined eye, and everything looks just so. And it looks like, oh, I just stumbled upon this kind of air. But there is a lot of energy that goes into that, and ensuring that it's the right, it was well, again, you said, curated is overused, but it was sort of well curated. And so I just thought, was thinking of those two aligning quite a bit when in
And
your.
if you look at the work of, like Mario's living room, that he moved into that apartment in 1976, and he added on to the wall of dog paintings, and there more things went up around the fireplace mirror and stuff. But essentially, when he died in 2018, it was the exact same decorating scheme. He never repainted, he never reupholstered. He maybe needed to reupholster by then, but it held. And Madeline Castang and Henri Samuel were both the very same, that you create a foundation that does not it never needs to be changed. It's sort of, and I hopefully people listening today who are into sustainability, it's like do it right the first time and properly the first time. And it's not about changing it every 3 years. It's not fashion, it's style. But how you can change it is recovering the sofa in a different fabric, or there are like little ways to restyle it to feel like you're changing things, but it's sort of investing in your surroundings. But of course, who lives anywhere now for 40 years? That's like
That's true.
so many of us are so much more nomadic than previous generations. So that is tricky.
That's true. And you really, yeah, you essentially describe timelessness and classic, going with doing it right the first time. I love that, because it is true. I did not. So my house is in an identity crisis right now, but it's so true, because, but also to your you made an excellent point that many people don't stay in the same place for that long. But if you are looking, if you're in a starter home, maybe do it one way. And then if you are raising a family and you think you're going to be there for a while, that's probably your time to shine because, and it will transition because then then we're talking about phases of life, but it can grow with you, I'm sure, in many, there are ways to do it. I'm not the professional, so I won't speak to that, but I'm confident there are ways to do that.
Yeah, I mean,
So,
Mario had the same set of curtains through 4 apartments, and he would just add to the bottom of them as his ceiling height got higher. So I think if you embrace this sort of Marie Kondo approach of buy things that you love, then you're always going to find a place for them no matter where you go. And I will also say, as somebody who's always rented in New York City, even if I was only there for a year, I've always painted my walls. And okay, yeah, you have to paint them back white or you just pay a little bit more of your security deposit. But there's something so transformative about having walls of a color that everything looks better. I mean, white walls are really tough, I think, to, and everything. Yeah, the color is I would say that way that like if you don't do anything else to your rental that you're not going to be in, just paint it.
mhm.
And when people come to visit me on 10th Street, all the walls are either wallpapered or emerald green or chartreuse or aubergine. And you can see, especially like younger people coming through, they're like, oh my God, color. And it's just such an easy thing to do. But I think we just don't, we think it's going to be such a pain to do, but it isn't. Once you do it, you've done it.
Absolutely. And I like to also point out, because I think, of course, the things that I share tend to be a little bit more maximalist classic, but a lot, because that's what I love and that's what I like to share. I get a lot of people who say that's beautiful, but it's too much color. I don't like
Yeah.
color. I would argue that just because you don't like a super punchy color, you probably still like color,
Yeah.
and color can be done in a more muted way.
Yeah.
White walls, like I think people are like white and gray walls or over the top color. There is a middle.
Yeah. Like pale,
I
pale,
think
pale
people sometimes don't know
aqua.
how to explore it.
Right. Yeah. You don't have to go for an orange wall. There are so many
Mhm.
gentler, like I love the Benjamin Moore historical color palette or and they also have like a special colonial Williamsburg palette.
Mhm.
And those colors all tend to be a little bit more gray, less clear. I actually prefer a clear color, which Mario did as well. But the like Palladian blue is like such a beautiful blue that I think anybody who's afraid of color would love that color. And it's not too bright. It just melts away into the background. So I think you're right. Like people think color and they're like, it's going to be like a Crayola box, but they're
Right.
especially like at the historical palette, which is so much more related to kind of earthy pigments and stuff. It's a gentler way to go.
Now, one of my last questions for you, I could I could ask you a million questions, but many designers like will go to design school or they have a
Right.
little bit of historical influence, but it's not quite the level of historical background that you bring to the table. And
Right.
so my question is, how do you feel that having as much historical understanding background plays into your design approach?
That's a great question. That is such a great question. I think when I show clients things like we have a young client right now who has a very strong point of view, which is exciting to work with. But she doesn't know all these historical precedents. And when I mean, you probably aren't going to come to me unless you love maximalism or you love an eclectic, probably more, antiques kind of point of view. So there are certain things that I show her, like there's this pair of plaster spiral white lamps that you could see Michael Taylor using, and also Jean-Michel Franck, but she didn't really, to her, they just look like these huge, clunky, kind of postmodern lamps. I'm not really answering your question, but I showed her, when I showed her the context, when I showed her a Michael Taylor room and like, I don't know, I think maybe Schiaparelli had them in her apartment. She still didn't like them, but I think at least she saw. I tried, but at least she saw like this is the context that I'm thinking. So I think as so many visual people do and designers have, I have a database of images in my mind. So when I approach a room, I am thinking of the architectural style, like what have I seen in the past that's glamorous, but that makes sense for that architectural style, and like how the room is going to be used. Is it a day room? It needs to be more light and airy, or is it a night room so it's more deep and saturated? Like what are the different influences I can draw upon? And so maybe I'm more aware than others that I'm looking at the past for inspiration, even though where we ultimately get to, especially because of the client has their own desires, it's going to be something definitely new. I mean, I'm the first to say I'm going through Mario's books and looking at his curtains and like, how did he solve that problem and that problem? I definitely go to my library to help me solve problems all the time. Does
I
that
love
answer the
it.
question?
Does. It absolutely does. And I know that's sort of a loaded question because at the end of the day, the history piece has been such a part of you that I'm almost asking you to dissect like something that you probably don't give much thought to because it's very innate. It does make your work more, not more unique. Everyone is bringing something to the table, but it's a unique perspective that not all folks in your line of work have.
Something else that's really important to me as a starting point is atmosphere. I think,
Mm.
rooms, seeing watercolors or photographs of rooms that speak to me, it really, I can't imagine everybody, like my husband certainly doesn't look at a watercolor of a room and like, wow, and is like taken off and transported to this blissful state. But rooms can really have that power over me. Ultimately, that's what I hope to create when I'm doing a room scheme is like, how can we create atmosphere? How can we, that all the parts together create a whole? And that's a frustration when, a client doesn't necessarily understand, they don't like some of the parts a lot, and then it's hard for them to understand how it's going to go to the whole, and when it's really fun when they care so much and they're so involved, like you want them to be,
Mhm.
but it can just, if you're not able to do that one little part, then sometimes it's like the whole thing needs to go into a different direction.
I was just about to mention that because it instantly reminds me of my event planning days. I did a lot of event design and
And you're creating
you
atmosphere
you
big
you
time.
do. You're creating an environment and a
Yeah.
feel. You're creating
Yeah.
an experience. And so you're trying to tell a story through the
Yeah.
design, at least I used to. You would pitch different concepts to clients and they would like parts of it, they would dislike parts of it, but sometimes they would get really really not stuck on, but really cling to certain elements. And
Yeah.
it's like, I came up with those ideas and of course I love them. But if we aren't doing them in this context, we need to revisit how they look because
Yeah.
you're seeing it in this suggested context. So
Yeah.
it makes sense and you're liking that. But if we stick it in something totally different, it's a totally different feel. It makes no sense. It will almost look out of place. And so
Yeah.
how can, like, what are you liking about that thing
Yeah.
that we can pull that feel that you're getting from it or the colors or whatever
Yeah.
to recreate it in a space that makes more sense. So it just instantly that felt very symbiotic.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, there's a logic to when you're coming to a scheme and everything. Again, it's like you're creating a universe, and that can be really frustrating when it doesn't. But then hopefully it actually comes together in a different, but even more interesting, exciting way. That's the
Mhm.
hope. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And often I will say, I mean, possibly in design, it often, I never wanted my ideas to be the only thing that were happening because it wasn't
Yes,
my day. It was supposed to be a representation of them. So
exactly.
often when they could take an element and we could rework it to make it more personal, it made it a more beautiful experience for everyone because they could instantly glean like, oh, that's so and so's favorite color, or that is because they travel a lot, or but
Oh,
again,
I'm
like making
such
sure you're pulling it and just reining it in a bit to make sure it works for what you're trying to do.
But because you've said a few times authenticity during our conversation, and I think that when it can feel more like the client and more personal and more
Mhm.
authentic, it's more powerful. I mean, that is such an important thing, is to capture the client. I mean, it's all
Right,
about the client, as you say,
right.
but they also want that wow atmosphere experience. And yeah, it's such a privilege to be entrusted to create that.
Was there anything else that I did not touch on that you feel called to share or
No,
people to
oh my
know?
God, you're so much fun to talk to.
Thank you. I've so enjoyed that. I could talk to you all day. I love this. This was so wonderful. The other thing I just want to throw out there, you and I are maybe looking at this one way, and I would never want anyone to listen to this, the earlier parts of our conversation about Mario and sort of his private life. And I think historically we can look at it from a different perspective. So I do just want to quickly address that.
I really appreciate you making a point of this, because I do feel very protective of him. And I lived with him. I was with him in the last few, I was with him when he died. I was with him the last several months of his life, almost every day. And then I continued to be with him and think about him every single day for like 2 more years as I was cleaning out his spaces. He's had an inordinate, no one else have I ever spent so much time thinking about. And this one client wrote me a note after reading the book, and he said, "Thank you for mentioning that Mario was gay." Like, it's the kind of thing that's never ever really said explicitly. Everybody just sort of assumes, but that I guess they could see themselves, or there was validation, and it's just a fact. That's how it was. And yeah, when I do share these thoughts of how did he become the way like why did he over collect, to put it in a nice way, like
Mhm.
why why did he have to see his name in print so much? Like, why was that so important to him? To make it a human story, as you said.
Right. I will make sure to, of course, share links to your books in our show notes. We'll make sure folks can access your website very easily. Thank you so, so much for taking the time to chat with me today.
Allie, I had such a great time. Thank you.